So, 2 years ago I made a video about Crunchyroll. I said some pretty unfavorable things, but I don't think I was wrong about any of it for the most part. Not much has changed since then. Crunchyroll's UI never really improved outside of mobile, its casting functionality is lacking, and its selection of shows is still shrinking in comparison to its competitors, which is probably why the deal confirming Sony's acquisition of them didn't surprise me. I know. The Sony deal happened a whole 3 months ago, but I'm not a news channel, I just comment on news that matters. And the streaming service that made the current anime industry possible being sold to a media entity that seems hell-bent on owning anime as a whole is pretty important. In all honesty, it puts me in a peculiar spot. I don't hate Crunchyroll. In fact, I stand by saying anime would be kind of in a worse spot without it, at least for Westerners. The continued existence of Crunchyroll as an overall entity may be on shaky ground, however the way Crunchyroll fits into the story of anime as a whole is important to that continued existence. But to illustrate why, I have to do that long-winded historicizing thing y'all love. The population of Japanese animation has always advanced in cycles. The initial wave was all the way back in the 60s, with Astro Boy becoming a smash hit and cementing itself in the global pop culture. The demand rises again with Speed Racer, followed by Gatchaman and Space Battleship Yamato. This was the era of Western otaku culture's prehistory, back when you had to find someone who actually knew Japanese and was willing to sit with you and explain every single story beat. Then came what I like to call the second boom, the late 80s through the early 90s. Akira, Ghost in the Shell, and the introduction of mainstays like Gundam, Dragon Ball, and Sailor Moon, you know the rest. Then came the boom I grew up through, the third boom, with Shonen Jump, Toonami, and Naruto on television, which then gave way to the rise of fansubbing for the kids who watched all the dub could give and switched over to subtitles. Then the 2008 financial crash happened, killed a bunch of Western distribution for anime, and turned illegal streaming into the only game in town. And for a time, it was good. Then came Crunchyroll, and the rest is history. Remember how in the introduction I said there were kids who stopped watching anime on TV and switched over to fan subs? Well, without knowing it, the fansubbing scene became a Magna Carta of sorts as to how anime was gonna adjust in the digital age. Back in 2007, having a database of anime to choose from on demand was an extremely new concept. Unless you lived near a video rental store that stocked anime DVDs and parents willing to let you rent them, you weren't getting your hands on anything that wasn't airing on television. Even then, you weren't getting the breadth of what Japanese animation had to offer. I touched upon this in a one-take editorial ages ago, but during the second Western anime boom, licensing companies would do their due diligence in cherry-picking the right shows for Western consumption. Once the internet became a factor, the role of gatekeeper shifted from the licensors to the fan-subbing scene. With this came a slew of shows getting translated that wouldn't have seen the time of day in the era of made-for-TV licensing. Not to mention, they also quickly outpaced the rate at which currently airing darlings were coming out officially. Ask anyone who grew up around the late 2000s how they got into watching subs, and I'm willing to bet they'd say they were watching some anime on TV, and when they found out there was more, but in Japanese, they decided reading wasn't difficult. Fan subs made it possible to watch more anime than you could have dreamed at the time, and as a current fan who grew up during that time but in a country where anime wasn't readily available, if not for those other fans going out of their way to make sure a whole selection of shows were available to whoever could find it, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I don't think anime would be where it is today as a media juggernaut if a bunch of nerds in their basements didn't play around with subtitling software on their computers, and for that, we should be thankful. This era coincided with the dawn of digital animation, and as such saw a massive amount of anime receive fan translations. This was the era of Haruhi, Lucky Star, Gundam 00, Death Note, Gurren Lagann, and plenty of other classics that most of you younger than 20 have been letting rot on your I'll get to it list for years. The anime that saw popularity in this era were pretty much the only shows that could guarantee a steady weekly release, while other anime would stay untranslated for months after airing until they were picked up by a group willing to sub them. Even though weebs in the West weren't getting everything, they were getting enough of it and close enough to the Japanese release that they weren't too unhappy with it, especially since, for the most part, it was all free. Japanese companies hated dealing with the internet because to them that's where all their cartoons got stolen, and American companies were still acting like it was 1998 and a home video release was still gonna move units. Nobody knew how to make money off these weird Japanese cartoons that were insanely popular. It was actually kinda hilarious. Here we were, a massive consumer pool of alienated pubescent kids who had just stumbled into this medium through television, as well as misanthropic adults who had been here since the 90s, all watching anime, yet barely any of us were paying for it. It was a sight to behold. Yet the reason nobody was paying for it was because there was no other experience that came close to the expedience and wide selection of fan subs. subs. If you wanted to go full on legit when it came to anime, there were no two ways around it. You'd have to deal with not seeing all the shows you wanted. And I'm sorry, but the weebs weren't having it. Fansubbing primed an entire generation of anime fans to expect near ubiquitous availability and expedient release of whatever show they wanted after it aired in Japan. There were, however, fans who swore up and down by never joining those dirty pirates in their thievery of Japanese animation. Good for them. They got their dream come true when a certain site known to charge its users for premium access went legit and turned its paywall into an actual business model. Crunchyroll is pivotal in this story because it was the first time anyone tried to solve the problem of getting as many shows as possible as soon as they launched in Japan to the Western fandom. Say what you will about Crunchyroll, I surely have, but it was a stroke of pure genius to capitalize on such a clear hole in the market. Not to mention having the wherewithal to not only offer subtitled anime at a similar rate as the pirates, but even going as far as to poach them and pay them for their work. And that's pretty much the reason why we live in a post-fansubbing world. There are still fansubs if you look, but nowadays they're mostly focused on translating stuff that's either been truly lost to time or shows that nobody else in the mainstream anime world is willing to bother with, or translating shows that Netflix scooped up but hasn't published yet.
サウロス様、申し訳ございません。お邪魔してしまったようで。
よい。見てみろ、ルーデウス。いつもと調子が違う。賢者モードだろうか。
ん？あれは？
わからぬ。しかし悪いものではない。
なぜそう思われるのでしょう。
そう考えた方が良いからだ。
なるほど。
Once Crunchyroll proved it was possible to turn online anime streaming into a major business model, it ran into the issue of not being able to measure up library-wise in the ongoing anime licensing arms race. These streaming wars eventually led to Crunchyroll's parent company going into that little Verve venture for a few years. And while I did like Verve, the way it was marketed made very little sense, especially for people who had already doubled down on years-long CR subscriptions. Now, however, it looks like Crunchyroll is being gobbled up by the closest approximation planet Earth has to a Japanese cyberpunk megacorp. And for a number of reasons, it leaves me both perplexed and deeply concerned for the fate of modern anime. Even with its shady history, Crunchyroll is in essence the last vestige of old fansubbing culture. Yes, they used to have a paywall for illegally acquired translations. Yes, the UI hasn't improved since the last time I made a video about them, which was 2 years ago, holy crap. Even with all the things that made them imperfect, and even with all the questionable ancillary decisions they've made with the Crunchyroll brand, I can't help but, on some level, regard that brand with a begrudging respect. I mean, it's cool to see something people used to watch anime when I was in middle school still kicking around as a slick multimedia enterprise in my late 20s. But now, like all things in this digitized matryoshka doll we call an economy, it's getting absorbed by a larger media entity. To be honest, it's anyone's guess what Sony even wants to do with Crunchyroll. They've already got Funimation, which is the brand that's been snatching the licenses that put Crunchyroll in this position in the first place. Even with the millions of users that come with the deal, the real reason behind this isn't the money involved with buying Crunchyroll as a service. The money is in owning Crunchyroll as a name. Sony now owns companies that produce animation, companies that produce voice talent and music, and now they own the twin faces of distributing anime in the West. I'm pretty confident when I say that Sony didn't need to do this. As far as anime goes, they're already a major participant in the industry. Buying out a middle market competitor isn't something that had to be done to straighten out the books exactly. Why I think Sony did this, other than the obvious monopoly reason, was to own anime. To own the brand of anime as it's understood by slightly in-the-know Western consumers. Funimation and Crunchyroll kind of understood this already, which is why they entered into that joint venture a few years ago, right before Sony bought them out of it. And now they came back and cleaned out the shop. Sony has effectively vertically integrated the exportation of Japanese culture. So that's it. That's the story of Crunchyroll. Eaten by a whale. What's gonna happen to the Crunchyroll Originals label? The convention in San Jose? The numerous staff members on employ who might be facing redundancies? Well, time will tell. But I can say for one thing, this is not good for anime.
Change the world. My final message. Goodbye.
In recent years, Crunchyroll and Funimation have been the primary ways that newcomers make their steps into watching more anime than your typical streaming service offers. Back when I was a teenager, watching anime was only limited by how many torrent sites you knew about, or how many illegal streaming links you had access to. The internet used to be decentralized, wild and untamed. I know asking for a return to those times is asking for the impossible. I don't think we can recapture the past, we can only learn from it. What specifically I think we should learn from is that there is no shame in piracy. When Crunchyroll went legit, it began its official marketing push by branding itself as a legal alternative to sketchy pirate sites. Like I said in my last Crunchyroll video, branding yourself as a legal alternative is only worth as much as you can offer to beat out the pirates. When big companies decide it's time to move in on internet distribution, it's usually done with the promise of cleaner user interfaces, higher quality streaming, better stability, and less buffering. Your average person isn't enough of a turbo nerd to boot up a torrent or scour Google results for a streaming link that doesn't capture you to death. Quite the contrary, Joe Sixpack likes it simple, streamlined, inoffensive. Anime has been going through this same metamorphosis. It's been streamlined to the point where the average person who fancies themselves an anime fan is railroaded by all of their anime sources into watching the same fixed number of shows. Pardon me for referencing a video only a relatively small amount of my audience has seen, but the filter is back, baby, and we didn't even notice it happened. And now we can put a name to the company that owns it. That wasn't just a pithy joke. Sony has vertically integrated the exportation of Japanese culture, and one company having all that power is never a good thing. One might ask, what exactly is getting filtered? Good question. In theory, we have progressed past the days where swearing off illegality meant a trade-off in access. You can feasibly watch every commercial anime in a given season legally, but if you're a newcomer with access to just Netflix, Crunchyroll, and Funimation, I'm sorry, you are definitely getting filtered. If you want to watch more than the mainstream offers, you have to contend with spending a ridiculous amount to cover all your streaming gaps, and even if you stick to a certain few, those libraries aren't stagnant. Licensing rights are a motherfucker, and just because you remember something being there last time you checked won't stop it from getting quietly pulled. My question to you is why? It's 2021. I'm sure by now we've dispelled any notions of the streaming paradigm being any less predatory and exploitative than ever before. Paying for a streaming service in 2021 is how you perpetuate the current mode of production and distribution, and that includes low wages for staff, garish shortcuts, anime plagued with production issues, and don't forget work-related deaths. We're grown, man. There's no shame in filling your streaming gaps with a few shady streams every now and then. Or better yet, you should go find a torrent somewhere. Or even better than that, go gather up some mates and start up a Plex. This video was made possible by me. And if you'd like to see more like it in the future, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Pledge $5 and you get a lifetime invite to my Discord, link in the description. Sayonara, minasan. Thanks for watching.
Finch Fetty. Finch Fetty. Finch Fetty.
I've been riding round the ends, I'm feeling like I need your